Joining us now on the line from New York, New York, Robert S. Boynton. He is director of the Literary Reportage Program at New York University. And Robert, we're glad to have you on the air with us tonight. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. As we take a look at a map of what they call the Hermit Kingdom, we know that North Korea is perhaps the most closed society in the world. So let's start here. Beyond government propaganda, what kind of information do North Koreans, generally speaking, have access to?
Well, they really don't have access to much information beyond government propaganda. The forms of media that they consume are very tightly controlled by the government. There are official newspapers, there are official broadcasts, there are official radio broadcasts, and anything else, strictly speaking, is illegal to consume. So that's sort of the beginning and the end of their media diet.
Illegal to consume, so tell me, how does the government prevent other sources of information from coming into people's hands?
Well, it's not entirely successful, but what they do is it's fairly comprehensive. They regularly jam shortwave and other radio broadcasts, as well as television broadcasts. They make every citizen who buys a radio get it fixed, meaning that it can only receive the official broadcast stations. Although having DVD players is legal, using anything in those players other than officially produced North Korean movies is illegal. So, both through sort of hard censorship and sort of softer ways of convincing people, they more or less forbid and prohibit the consumption of anything that is not made in the country.
How widely available is the internet?
The internet is so unavailable for all intents and purposes. One could say that it is unavailable. There's a tiny portion of the North Korean elite which can use the internet, and from what I gather, even their use of the internet is heavily censored and monitored. So they oddly enough, they do have internet cafes in most of the main cities in North Korea, but when one goes to those cafes, one is usually using computers in a fairly rudimentary way, playing online video games and things like that. So there is no official open connection to the internet at all.
Robert, is there any way to know whether the people know what they're missing?
Well, 10, 15 years ago, I think that there was no way to know that people knew what they were missing. People were living largely within the very constrained framework. In the last 10 or 15 years, I think that most North Koreans have, in one way or another, gotten information about the world beyond North Korea, whether through South Korean DVDs of soap operas or radio broadcasts, shortwave radio broadcasts, or other kind of printed material that manages to come in. So the grip over the access to media, though still extremely tight, has loosened somewhat.
Let's follow up on that by reading an excerpt that you did for, I guess it was the Atlantic magazine. Here's how it goes. Given this isolation, it's even more remarkable that since 2004, a half-dozen independent media organizations have been launched in Northeast Asia to communicate with North Koreans, to bring news out of the country, as well as to get potentially destabilizing information in. What has happened to create those conditions where news actually can come out of North Korea?
Well, a number of things has taken place in the last decade or so. The major one is that the collapse of communism in the late 80s deprived North Korea of the resources it was getting from various members of the Eastern Bloc and from Russia, and that made it such that they were thrown back on their own resources and went through sort of a tailspin economically. Then in the mid to late 90s, there were a number of terrible storms and floods that obliterated a number of crops, and it brought in a terrible famine in the mid to late 90s that killed an estimated anywhere between 1 and 2 million people, which is about 5%, 10% of the population. So when the famine took place, all of a sudden North Koreans who had been fed and clothed and housed by the state since the very creation of the state in 1947, 48, all of a sudden found that they were not able to get food. And a number of them started going over the border into China to get food. And when they came back, they brought with them not only food, but information and all sorts of other sources of news. So that was sort of the very beginning of this transfer of information back and forth between North Korea and China, South Korea, Japan.
Let me also ask you about something that I know we all take for granted, but is quite unique there, and that is copies of bootlegged South Korean soap operas, which I gather they play on their very old consumer electronics gadgets. How did all of that become available?
Well, South Korean soap operas are the rage all throughout Asia, in Japan as well, and there's no reason why that wouldn't be the case in North Korea. And what started happening was that traders who had been going back and forth between North Korea and China were looking for things to trade, looking for things to sell, and they wanted, obviously, to bring back things they could sell for a profit. So China, being the great creator of copyrighted material, great duplicator of copyrighted material, easily duplicated thousands and thousands of these discs for sale for very little money in North Korea. So a lot of these traders started bringing these over, and they found that there was a huge market for these sorts of things because they were sort of addicted to these, to the storyline, just as anyone in any country can get addicted to the storyline in a soap opera.
That's a great way to describe what the Chinese do. You call them the great duplicator. They steal, right? That's what you're trying to say. They just rip it off.
That's a less elegant way to say it, yes.
Less elegant, okay. Can you tell whether or not people inside the regime use this material as well?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think that there's the taboo against using these materials, viewing non-standardized, forbidden material, was broken long ago, and it's been pretty clear in North Korean society that you can get yourself out of pretty much anything with a bribe, and the more wealthy you are, the larger the bribe you can pay, and the rules are much less strict for people in the upper classes. So, no question that they are making as much, if not more, use of all these things, whether it's radio, television, or internet, not internet, or DVDs.
Gotcha. Tell me, who's able to get news out of North Korea?
Well, that's the trickiest thing. One of the things I was fascinated by, I've been going back to the region since 2008, and go back about every year, once or twice, to do research and reporting. And in 2008, I was interviewing some editors at a publication called the Daily NK, which is one of these news organizations I write about in the Atlantic Monthly in April. And in 2008, I was interviewing the editor-in-chief of it, and he said to me, well, I said, where do you get your information? Well, we get it through these sources, and of course we have these reporters inside North Korea. Well, I was so startled by this that I actually asked my translator to retranslate my question and retranslate his response, because I was sure that something had been mistranslated. But indeed, there are these sort of growing core of these independent citizen journalists inside North Korea who, one way or another, bring information out and give them to these news organizations, whether in China or South Korea.
Speaking of getting out, let me ask you about getting in. You write some, on occasion, I guess, information about this place that I presume they wouldn't want the outside world to know. You have any problem getting into North Korea?
I've never gotten into North Korea.
You've never gotten in, so you're always going through the South.
Yes. I was supposed to go to North Korea actually last fall, and then someone in Pyongyang got wind that I was working on this project, and my visa was withdrawn.
But hope springs eternal. I guess you hope someday you're going to make it in?
Someday, one way or another, I'm sure I will make it in, yes.
Gotcha. Now, of course, it would be extremely dangerous to try to sneak contraband materials of any kind out of North Korea. Why do you think people are willing to take those kinds of risks?
Well, that's a good question, and in fact, it is extremely dangerous. Anyone performing what you or I would consider acts of journalism, namely getting information and circulating it, they are considered officially as spies. And the sentence for spying inside North Korea is anything from a labor camp to something much more treacherous to execution. So they are very much taking their lives literally into their own hands to do this. As to the question of why they do it, I think it differs. It's sort of like the reasons anyone goes into journalism. There are many different reasons. They want people in the outside world to know what's going on there. They believe that that sometimes the information is being overwhelmed by the propaganda. Some of them do it for money because they get paid to do that. That's one of the reasons why we do journalism as well. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons, but I think it springs from a desire, anything from toppling the regime to simply hoping that their country, which they love, is seen in a better light by the outside world.
In your view, is the information that does get out significant?
Very. There is a real question, since the situation is so constrained, the reporting done is done such difficult circumstances, there's a question about the accuracy of much of it. What one observes in one town in the north of northern Korea, in the northern section of North Korea, may not be representative of what's going on in the whole country. People's perceptions are skewed. These are not trained journalists, so a lot of the information is incomplete and sometimes even incorrect, as is much of the information that the Western media reports. But the question about whether it's important is, I can answer unequivocally, yes, it is important, if only because up until these news organizations existed, the outside world, whether they were journalists or experts or so-called experts on the region, subsisted on what was, I would say, was rumor and old news and propaganda, or some combination of those. So this is the news coming out of these organizations has changed the entire game of looking at and trying to understand what's going on in North Korea for the person who wants to do that.
Well, that leads nicely to a follow-up question I was going to ask about accuracy, because if you think back to Iraq almost 10 years ago, we were getting a lot of information from dissidents about what was going on in Iraq. It turned out that much of that information was not only wrong, but was purposefully misleading in order to encourage the United States to invade, which of course is what did happen. So how trustworthy is this information that we're getting from sources inside North Korea to the outside world?
It's an open question, and it's one that there's been a lot of debate in recent months, not only around my article, but around the issue in general. And I have to say, I think some of it has been quite unfair. First, the assumption is often falsely that there is this Western form of media or Western form of journalism which is transparent and delivers verified, triple-checked information, which, as in your question you indicated, is not always the case. Secondly, the kinds of information that I find most useful and most trustworthy tends to be the least controversial stuff, by which I mean whenever I'm reading sort of palace intrigue about who's going to succeed Kim Jong-il, the current leader of North Korea, or other things like that, I'm quite skeptical because there are very few people in position to know anything like that. So, I read that much more along the lines of the kind of gossip that here in the United States we read in, say, the New York Post or some of the other sorts of tabloids. Some of it turns out to be true, much of it turns out to be false, but we don't really take it that seriously. The kind of things I do take very seriously, and actually have gone to some lengths to verify as I was working on this subject, are very empirical, close to the ground reports. The level of rice harvest that year, the level of the fullness or emptiness of various markets in some of the cities. Things that you can verify either through other sources, through photographs, through video, things like that. So I think, and when it comes to those sorts of issues, which are not necessarily the kinds of things that sort of Pyongyang watchers talk about, there is actually a very high level of accuracy.
Well, let's finish up on this then, Robert. How could these changes that we've been talking about in the flow of information out of the country potentially influence regime change?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think that anyone who tries to guess or speculate about the future of North Korea is doomed to be wrong. I have people in Seoul who are constantly telling me that the North Korean regime is, fill in the blank, days, weeks, months away from collapse. And I always say, let me tell you about this island off the coast of Florida, which has also been in imminent collapse for the last 50 or 60 years. So that said, I think that the fact that North Koreans on all levels of society are now accessing and making regular use of non-official, non-sanctioned information is itself an extraordinary level of independence and something that really frightens the state. Whether or not this kind of independence leads to anything beyond that in a society where there is no room for dissent and no room for, popular gatherings or convocations of any sort is an open question. But the very fact that they are at all levels now consuming information from the outside world that they know very well is forbidden is itself a quiet form of revolution that's going on, and there's no way to stop that.
Robert S. Boynton from NYU, we not only thank you for coming on TVO tonight to tell us about the Hermit Kingdom, but we wish you well in your efforts to actually get inside it someday. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.